Kalimera. Good morning. I just want to mention, first of all, my background. So I'm an urban anthropologist, and my PhD research was on an old Greek and Armenian neighborhood in Istanbul, where I examined the impact of migration and diversification, kind of similar to if I missed all your comments, but similar to the neighborhood you mentioned in Thessaloniki. And had I presented on that, it would have very nicely complemented the theoretical framework that you set in the beginning. And actually, I also looked at kind of how migration and diversity impacts housing. So I looked at like informal housing strategies such as room rental, the room rental sector. So that would have also been kind of relevant to the previous presentations. But I'm going to talk now about my other hat, which is kind of linked to more policy research that I do at a more macro scale, primarily through kind of looking at the different EU-funded and UNHCR-funded or UN-funded projects in Turkey in the context of the Syrian refugee programs. So yes, when I started this project initially, sorry, to take a step back. Since 2014 in Turkey, I think also now I'm hearing in Greece, this idea of community centers as a social intervention in the refugee context became very popular. So a lot of different donor programs became heavily invested in funding community centers across Turkey, primarily linked with Syrian refugees. So I was kind of interested in doing more of an anthropology or an ethnography of a single community center initially. And I wanted to look at kind of how do these community centers play a role in terms of facilitating integration and social cohesion with the host communities. But then I kind of, when I was looking for literature to what is a community center, I realized that there was actually not much that had been written about it, neither in Turkey or internationally, actually. So I decided to kind of look at what is this practice, but also to look at its history in Turkey, because I recognize that it's not the community center phenomena is not something that just arrived with refugees. It has a history in Turkey, as I'm sure it has here also in Greece. And I distinguish, and this is what I'll be presenting now, four historically and kind of conceptually distinct types of typologies of community centers in Turkey. And in the end, I'm going to try and maybe brainstorm a little bit about why I think this understanding is significant. So the first kind of model is one I title Social Welfare and Participatory Urbanism. And this emerged in Turkey during the 1990s. So in Turkey, starting in the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of internal migration. So basically from when in the 1950s, Turkey's population demography was 25% urban to kind of 75% rural. Today that has completely shifted. So, there was a process of urbanization, a lot of internal migrants arriving in the cities, and the formation of kind of the ghetto neighborhoods, marginalized neighborhoods. So this first model really emerged as part of the social work discipline. And it was funded mainly by the Ministry of, or the idea emerged mainly through the Ministry of Social Services in Turkey, but also a lot of different municipalities and NGOs during the 1990s started establishing these community centers in marginalized urban neighborhoods where a lot of internal migrants had arrived. And the core principles, I mean, I'm looking at definitions, by the way, not assessing any impact or anything, but how these centers were defined in documents. So here you see community being defined as a whole, so all members, children, elderly, women, all members of the community, and they're defined geographically. So usually they are like defined by the name of a neighborhood. And they use kind of flexible programming, depending on local needs. And there's a heavy emphasis on participation, solidarity, democratic participation, urban citizenship, or perhaps this is a well-known concept, access to the city. So it's about how, internal migrants, they have issues of urban adaptation. How do we make them better urban citizens? How do we facilitate their access to the city? So, and actually, after these centers were opened in 2000, the state developed a regulation on community centers where these in the definition of a community center, you have these core principles that I've identified. But in 2013, the AKP government annulled this regulation and closed down all community centers in Turkey, the state-run community centers. And a new regulation was introduced, a regulation on social service centers. And I mean, you can't kind of see these as a replacement or a renaming of the community center, because again, when you look at the definition of what a social service center is, it's about facilitating access to existing social services. So, you know, like disability assistance or elderly care. It's kind of like, you know, the macro social welfare program of Turkey being kind of facilitated at a much more local level. So in my personal view, it's a very distinct understanding, and it's not a community center. They're more like kind of bureaucratic structures. And this model of community centers that became popular during the 1990s, many of the NGOs as well, so not just the state-run community centers, they were closed down. You have only one really remaining example, which is Tarlabaşı Community Center in Istanbul, and some of you might know this is also an old Greek neighborhood that has received a lot of layered migration flows over the several decades, and kind of they also, when you look at their definition, it's about, you know, access to the city. So that's the first model. And the second one, this is, I define it as sustainable human development and women's empowerment. So again, it's a model that emerged during the 1990s as part of a regional development program in Turkey, very well known by the abbreviation GAP, the GAP project, which stands for the Southeastern Anatolia Development Program. And as you can see, Southeastern Anatolia is basically with the border of Syria and Iraq. And, you know, this is the primarily Kurdish regions of the country. So, and it's, you know, for decades, since the 60s, this has been kind of one of the most problematic, politically, economically, socially problematic regions of the country. And so this was a state-initiated, by the Ministry of Development, a state-initiated development program. It was an economic, regional, agricultural program, or it started mainly as an infrastructure program, but it also incorporated a social component. And one of the social programs of the GAP project is called the Multi-Purpose Community Centers, and it's also well known by the acronym CHATOM. And basically, when you look at the definition of these chatoms, they talk, you know, there's this global human development discourse and a very much an emphasis on women's empowerment. So compared to the previous center model, here there's actually a focus on women only, but they're also neighborhood and location defined community centers. And today in Turkey, they still operate across 9 provinces. You have 44 centers. And like the previous model, again, there's, you know, the term participation appears a lot in the definitions, but also you see it much more structured. So actually, the people managing these centers are local women, and they're elected locally by the participants to the center. Both, there's the center manager is a person, a local resident, and also you have management committees. I mean, I don't know how well actually this participatory structure works in practice. There's a lot of critiques about kind of the politics behind this locally, but I won't go into that. But so we've had these centers since the 1990s, but of course this is the region that has been most impacted by the Syrian refugee arrivals over recent decades. And it wasn't immediate that these centers started incorporating refugees, but now some of the centers have like programs run through UNDP, and they're providing language courses, social cohesion programs. So gradually they've also started integrating Syrian refugees into their programs. Sorry. So a third model that can be identified is social municipal work and localized service delivery. So, and this is kind of, this also has a very long history, and if there's anybody here from local, I think there's people here from local government and from municipalities, but I found it was linked to this idea in Turkey. It's a Turkish term I've recognized, and maybe in Greek you have a different term that's been used for this, but it's about the social municipality. So, you know, generally you conceive, or in Turkey for a long time, municipalities were just about kind of local infrastructural investment. But starting in the 1970s, with some of the metropolitan municipality elections, the municipalities started getting involved in social programs as well. And actually, the biggest turning point was in the 1990s when the Welfare Party was elected, and then the Justice and Development, the AKP Justice and Development Party, their election in the 2000s, you had kind of a more concrete institutionalization and legalization of this notion of a social municipality becoming incorporated into law. So what this means is that basically municipalities are given very extensive duties and responsibilities to intervene in local social issues, and this is, it's a very broad field, from provision of social assistance, opening soup kitchens, providing housing, health, education, sports, cultural, you name it, like very broad field. And of course, how social municipality is interpreted by each municipality depends on their political ideology. So currently in Turkey, the more conservative parties have a heavier focus on social assistance, whereas, the Social Democrats focus more on kind of social development. One aspect of these social municipality is opening of community centers, and actually the name is never really community center, like toplum merkezi is the term we use in Turkish. They use a very broad range of names, and usually they derive from these 5 terms that you'll see listed there: mahalle, neighborhood, semt, district, ev, home, konak, mansion, merkez, center. So it can be neighborhood center, neighborhood home, district mansion, like they use a diversity of names. It doesn't matter what they use in the end, because actually when you look at the types of support they offered, it's very similar, but of course it depends on where this community center is located. So if it's more in a middle-class neighborhood, there'll be more of a focus on sports and cultural activities, whereas if it's a more impoverished neighborhood, they'll be providing social assistance, awareness-raising courses, etc. And when you look at the definition of these terms, there's this focus on, bringing services to your feet at the neighborhood. So it's really about kind of localizing municipal services at the very, very local level and making services accessible. And in terms of how kind of this model has been impacted with refugee arrivals, many community many municipal, I haven't done research about how much the existing community centers have incorporated refugees, but there's a little bit of because municipalities are elected through votes of the local population, and because local populations often resent or are not willing to share services with the refugee arrivals, not many centers in my research have actually incorporated refugees, but one strategy, and for those of you who were here yesterday, I mentioned about municipalities starting to open NGOs. So this is kind of a way, I won't go into the technicalities, but this is kind of a discrete way of providing services. By opening an NGO, they're able to access EU funds, for instance. So they open separate refugee centers. So they don't incorporate into the existing ones, and I'll be showing one model in a while. They open this NGO, receive external funding. So this is kind of a way that they can explain to their voters that, they're not actually providing through taxpayers' money services to the refugees. And the IOM has also been funding something called migrant services centers, but for time I won't go into this. So this is a district of Istanbul called Sultanbeyli that has received one of the highest percentage of refugees. And what they did is you don't see the name of the district or the municipality anywhere, but everybody knows that this is the municipality center because the governing body is formed by people who are working in the municipality. But they founded something called the Refugees Association. And it's a very interesting model because what I call here, it's a public civil society enterprise. The red panel you see at the top is the migration administration. So the central, what would you call it? The central Migration Ministry of Turkey, their branch office in Istanbul is actually located in this NGO's community center's top floor. So this is where Syrian refugees who need to register with the police or with the authorities go to this center's top floor. There's a health clinic in the middle, and then there's kind of the community center component where they offer language courses, awareness raising, etc. And then in the ground floor, they've rented out to a local enterprise who has a kebab shop there. So it's a very kind of interesting third sector, first sector, second sector merging all in this single building. So then the final model, which kind of builds on the presentation you made, and this is more the fourth model that emerged in the recent decade after Syrian refugee arrivals into Turkey, which is on which kind of builds on this global discourse emerging since the 1990s around this figure of the urban refugee, and the urban refugee being compared to the camp refugee. So as you know, for many decades, refugees were actually being contained in camps, and the urban refugees emerged as a phenomena that required a different mode of intervention. And then this is when you started, when the UNHCR most notably started using this or developing this understanding of community-based interventions. And you have a lot of different UNHCR policy documents that I've listed here that kind of develop this approach, this community development approach, community-based protection approach. And this is where you also start seeing the emergence of the notion of a community center as a mode of community-based protection. And in Turkey, as I mentioned in the introduction, since 2014, the UNHCR, the EU, have been funding a lot of different community centers across Turkey. And again, like the municipal model, you see a multiplicity of names being used, and I noticed in the one that you showed as well, you have a different, so some call them multi-service centers, there's some call them support centers, some use the name community centers, or there's like the Refugee Association, they call it the Refugee Center or Support Home. You have many different names again, but essentially kind of a similar understanding in terms of services being provided. And here, when you look at how is this community center defined, or how are their programs, there's of course a heavy emphasis on protection. And protection, sorry, yeah, I'm almost done. So the idea is about making services accessible to refugees, so facilitating their access to kind of existing services, public services, but also recently there's more of a focus on social cohesion, and again, kind of the example you presented about, trying to involve host communities as well. Yeah, I won't go into state interventions. I mean, this model has also seen fluctuations in recent years. But here, so the Turkish Red Crescent is kind of the big actor at the moment. And for those of you who were present yesterday, part of this reason is because the Turkish Red Crescent is kind of conceived as a, pro-government NGO in Turkey. So they've been received a lot of EU funds to open community centers throughout Turkey. And they kind of have this modular program. I mean, they say it's very flexible, but basically every community center has a hairdresser, has a whatever. I mean, it's the similar physical structures, similar employment strategies, etc. And then this is the Human Resources Development Foundation in Istanbul, that they have a community center as well, just for you to see kind of what the physical structures are like. And this is in Gaziantep, kind of another big NGO in Turkey that operates different community centers. It's in Adana. And this is the Support to Life Foundation in Urfa. So just kind of you can have a quick look at what are the kinds, I mean, the main distinction of this model from the previous ones is that there's case management kind of as a refugee program. And okay, so just for time's sake, this is kind of a summary of I can go leave this for the Q&A session. So kind of just the final question about why is this kind of significant? There was a discussion about, facilitating integration. So what do we understand from integration? Is integration merely about, ensuring that refugees have access to services? I mean, this is one way of conceiving it, but then when you look at the older models, so for instance, about the first model I described, urban integration was about kind of instilling values of participation, of democratic participation, being elected on boards, taking a role, using the city. So really, to kind of looking at this model to tickle what we mean by integration, and then defining our strategies according to that. And I mean, this is just a funny way, a graph of the way I try to position these different centers in terms of where they stand, in terms of who is the community. So when you're talking about a community center, are we talking about a geographically and locally identified community? Or in the refugee case, usually it's defined by a group. So they are primarily centers for refugees, but let's say they're including more and more host communities. And then also in terms of where they stand regarding their purposes, is actually service access or service delivery the primary goal, or is actually participation, where service delivery is more like the tool for an end, which is about participation. So I hope that makes sense, and thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.